7 years is a good long stretch in Hollywood in terms of evaluating how things have changed, how the media landscape has changed, but also in seeing how audience expectations and reactions have evolved quite considerably, I would say. Films that were woke sometimes still managed to turn a profit back then, and they were seen as evidence that this is what people wanted. Vindication, as it were. Well, not so much anymore. Yeah, I mean, back in 2016, you had the likes of Ghostbusters, which didn't make an awful lot of money, but it was a woke feminist flop, I would say. And in 2019, you had Charlie's Angels, which was also a flop. And 2019 is specifically the year I want to focus on because it is 7 years ago. And that was also the year that we had Captain Marvel from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, which of course was the concluding part in the sequel trilogy. What's common about those two films is that they were both part of what were at the time very strong cinematic franchises. The MCU brand and the Star Wars brand, they were rock solid back then, probably at the peak of their powers in 2019. And in the case of Captain Marvel, it was released in between Infinity War and Endgame. So much anticipation for Endgame. So Captain Marvel was always going to make a fortune. It made over $1.1 billion at the box office, as you can see here from Box Office Mojo. That story really followed the well-worn Mary Sue path of the strong female protagonist who never had to go on any real journey, never really made any mistakes, never had to overcome her failings. She was perfect all along. It was just external factors getting in her way, really nothing to learn, no reason to change, etc. But the MCU was in rude health in 2019, and the idea of an MCU flop was just unthinkable at that stage. But now, 7 years later, the magic of that franchise has faded, and the box office successes have become the exception rather than the rule. If Captain Marvel came out today, I suspect it would be a flop, possibly as bad as its successor, The Marvels. Audiences are so much more discerning now than they were, and much less accepting of the mediocrity and agenda-driven storytelling, and just much less forgiving of it all. When they get a sense from trailers, they've just been burned too many times over the years. So they're very cautious. They're on the lookout for really anything that's going to set them off. And that's why people were skeptical of Supergirl before it was released. That's why there's negative backlash now to the Odyssey movie, because people can see elements of wokeness, even if it's just a hint here and there. They get turned off immediately. And Star Wars is another example of this. The brand has been very badly impacted by several poor TV shows, and of course the Rise of Skywalker. It was a bad movie. It was eye-rolling. If it was released today, I don't think it would make $1 billion at the box office like it did in 2019. It was the most paint-by-numbers safe, unimaginative Star Wars movie I could think of. Making Rey basically the sum of all the Jedi. I think it was a disservice to many of the characters that came before. It was a lazy movie. Everything about that film felt lazy and stuck in second or third gear. And now Star Wars has continued down that same road for several years, safe, bland, to the point where, the most recent Mandalorian and Grogu film was a massive flop. It was just a massive flop. So these two franchises, Star Wars and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, were once too big to fail. Smaller movie franchises like, your Charlie's Angels or Terminator, because of course there was a Terminator movie released in 2019, which was Dark Fate, horrendous. Those kind of franchises lacked the cultural invincibility that Star Wars and the MCU had achieved at that time. But now, the law of diminishing returns has well and truly set in. What was possible to get away with in 2019 just isn't today. It's just not. Studios, filmmakers don't get away with the same because audiences don't give them that kind of latitude. They don't give that kind of leeway anymore. It doesn't matter how big the franchise is or was. It's just as capable of bombing at the box office as any other smaller IP. And I know there's a lot of frustration out there among audiences, or you might say just a general apathy. And people are skeptical of new releases. They're mindful of anything in trailers or promotional materials or statements made by filmmakers or actors in promotional interviews in the run-up to the release of a film. But having said that, I do think that the time we're living in now, as film audiences, I think it's far better. I think it's far better for audiences because audiences are more vigilant in a way that they weren't in 2019. When they were more complacent. If Supergirl had been released in 2019, let's say if Supergirl had been an MCU movie and it was released in 2019, in between Infinity War and Endgame, you can expect that it would have done far better at the box office than it did today. And I'm not saying it would have cleared $1 billion, maybe not, but I doubt it would have been the massive box office flop that it is now in 2026. And I think audience standards are much higher. I think standards are higher. People are not parting with their hard-earned money for generic slop to the degree they once did. And so I'm interested to see how much this is going to affect, if at all, the Odyssey. And we're going to know soon. I do anticipate a relatively big opening weekend domestically. I think it's going to have a big opening weekend domestically. But we have seen some massive drop-offs in second weekends. And if word of mouth isn't extremely positive for the Odyssey, who knows where it's going to end up by the time its theatrical run ends. Obviously, Christopher Nolan is riding high off the massive success of Oppenheimer, which almost cleared $1 billion worldwide back in 2023. But the Odyssey is carrying a bit of baggage. It's carrying a bit of negative sentiment. Still, average cinema-going audiences are, I think, largely unaware of much of the complaints. And they may simply be aware that, hey, look, there's a new Christopher Nolan movie coming out this summer. It stars Matt Damon. It's a big, epic fantasy. And maybe they've seen one or two TV spots and they like the look of it. And that's really as far as their knowledge of the film goes. So don't underestimate that is still a significant portion of the general cinema-going audience. And this film may get a lot of walk-up sales as well. So that might be enough to put a lot of bums on seats, as it were, for the opening weekend. But at the same time, we have to remember we're not living in 2019 anymore, and standards have changed. So we'll see. It's going to be an interesting few weeks. So let's see what happens. Looking forward to your thoughts on this one in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. Take care. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.